כוח צה"ל זיהה בשוגג 3 ישראלים חטופים כאיום. כתוצאה מכך, הכוח ירה לעברם והם נהרגו.
The 3 hostages were abducted by Hamas during its October 7th attack on multiple Israeli communities. Expressing deep remorse over that incident, the IDF says it bears responsibility for everything that happened and that immediate lessons have been learned as it continues its onslaught in Gaza. IDF's spokesperson said that the army believes that these hostages either escaped or were abandoned by militants who held them captive, and they are further investigating to ascertain more details. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called the incident unbearable tragedy. The news has infuriated many Israelis who are protesting near the Israeli Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv. These include relatives of hostages still held by Hamas. The U.S. has also reacted and has called the incident heartbreaking. White House says it expects Israel to conduct a thorough investigation. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby also reacted to that incident. Israel has been facing mounting international pressure and isolation for its offensive that has killed thousands so far. The country also acknowledged that nearly 1/5 of its soldiers have been killed so far in the war, and they've died due to friendly fires or other accidents. Even though the IDF claims of making significant advancements, it is also paying a quote-unquote heavy price.
Of course, let's start right off with what's happening in West Asia. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he is more determined now more than ever to continue the war with Hamas. And this even as the White House top advisor Jake Sullivan, who is in Israel to negotiate, he told him categorically to scale down the Gaza offensive. Now, Sullivan met Netanyahu and the rest of Israel's war cabinet on Thursday. The White House says he urged Israel to shift from high-intensity military operations to a more targeted phase now. Speaking to the media, he said that governance of the West Bank and Gaza Strip needs to be connected under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Earlier, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said it will take more than several months to destroy Hamas. But what does that mean for the ongoing war? Will it continue for those many months? Of course, we are tracking those answers as well. Israel faces mounting international pressure and isolation amid its onslaught that has killed thousands so far. Even its strongest ally, the US, wants Israel to be careful now.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
Jake Sullivan will also meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah on Friday. Ahead of this meet, the Palestinian Prime Minister has expressed disappointment with the US veto on UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and has urged the US to act on implementing a two-state solution.
Every American official who arrives here to meet with us, they again repeat the same thing, that United States is for two states. Now that United States has talked the talk, we want Washington to walk the walk. Meaning that we need specific measures to implement the two-state solution, not only believe in two states.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog, meanwhile, has joined other Israeli officials against a possible two-state solution for long-lasting peace in the region.
In order to get back to the idea of dividing the land or negotiating peace or talking to the Palestinians, etc., one has to deal first and foremost with the emotional trauma that we're going through and the need and demand for full sense of security for our people.
Now, amid the negotiation efforts, Israel continues with its offensive in Gaza. The Israeli military says dozens of Hamas fighters surrendered in the last 24 hours itself, while internet and telephone services providers in Gaza said that communications were cut across the war-torn area on Thursday. Now, viewers, on the other hand, of course, this was the Israeli side. Hamas, on the other hand, has played down Israel's attempts to flood the group's tunnels in Gaza. Just to let you know, Israel planned on flooding the tunnels underneath Gaza, which Hamas has used for their strategic advantage. Israel planned to flood them with seawater. Now, Hamas says when militants built them, they took all considerations of what could happen in case of an attempt to flood these tunnels.
Those tunnels were built by well-trained and educated engineers, and they have considered any kind of attacks may happen by the Israelis, including bombing water.
Violence also rages on in the West Bank. Israeli troops killed 12 Palestinians in raids on Thursday inside the city of Jenin. Palestinian authorities accused desecration of a mosque by some Israeli soldiers as it condemned the operation as a dangerous escalation. The Israeli army said it would discipline the soldiers on the reports of desecration.
So it's been over 2 months since Israel launched its campaign of relentless bombing of the Gaza Strip. And Hamas has said that the death toll of the people who have been killed in this campaign of Israeli bombings has now risen to over 18,700. The majority of them are said to be women and children. The big question, of course, is when will this war end? And if Israeli defense minister is to be believed, then it is likely to take several months to come. The United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan arrived in the war-struck nation. He, of course, arrived in Israel at a time when Israel is finding itself increasingly isolated in international politics. There are calls for exercising restraint that are being echoing louder as the humanitarian situation is getting worse in the Gaza Strip. Jake Sullivan is on a 2-day visit to Israel. The timeline of the Israel-Hamas war and the future of Gaza is what is on the agenda. The Israeli defense minister reportedly has said that it will take several months for this war to end.
The Hamas is a terror organization that built itself for a decade to fight Israel. And they build infrastructure under the ground and on the ground. And it is not easy to destroy them. It will take and require a long period of time. It will last more than several months. But we will win and we will destroy them. So thank you once again for coming to Israel, for helping us, and for supporting us.
The leaders have also discussed about the need for the Israelis to return to their home after they were evacuated from the northern border with Lebanon. The leaders are also expected to discuss the next phase of the war. And this comes a day after the Israelis reported their heaviest losses on the battlefield. Israel has said that 10 of its soldiers were in fact killed in the last 24 hours. Currently, the fighting is underway both in the north and also in South Gaza. And despite Washington supporting Israel, there is a clear rift that seems to be growing with regards to the future of Gaza. The American president earlier remarked that due to Israel's indiscriminate campaign of bombing the Gaza Strip, Israel is losing support from the international community, and that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu should in fact change his tactics. While the wartime president has said that Israel would fight on despite the international pressure.
ואני אומר את זה גם נוכח הכאב הגדול, אבל גם מול הלחצים הבינלאומיים. שום דבר לא יעצור אותנו. אנחנו הולכים עד הסוף, עד הניצחון. לא פחות מזה. ואני מודה לכם. אנחנו עושים את זה בזכותכם, באמצעותכם, בעזרת השם ובעזרתכם. תודה רבה לכם.
The Biden has also added that Israel can't say no to a Palestinian state. Israel, however, has explicitly rejected any idea of a Palestinian state, while the United States favors the idea of a Palestinian authority returning to govern Gaza after the war is over. The United States earlier said that there remains a clear gap between what Israel intends to do and what the results that it is producing on the ground. Now, according to reports, the United States has delayed the delivery of about 20,000 M16 rifle rifles, and reports in fact highlight the reason could in fact be the rising attacks by extremist illegal Israeli settlers against the Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. This is a place where there is no Hamas. The situation in the Gaza Strip is very dire. Since the Israel-Hamas war started, thousands of people have been killed, while at least 50,000 Palestinians have been grievously injured or have been maimed in this conflict. 1.8 million Palestinians have in fact been driven out of their homes. Hospitals in the north have largely stopped functioning, while in the south they have been overwhelmed with patients. Israel says it has been encouraging aid into the Gaza Strip, while the United Nations has said that aid delivery has virtually been completely hampered due to the continuous strikes. And we earlier spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is a military expert and also a host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Listen to what he has to say.
Poll numbers that you cited just a moment ago is pretty sobering information and really confirms what many people here in the United States and apparently in the administration has been saying, is that you can't kill your way to peace in this situation. You can't just say we're going to kill all the Hamas fighters and then we're going to have peace, because you see there's been such a massive destruction of the ability of the Palestinians to even live after this is over, on top of the scores of thousands that have been killed and tens of thousands more that have been wounded. All that does is breed more contempt for Israel and more hatred. And when you see both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, actually a higher percentage of people in the West Bank in that same poll said that they believed that Hamas was right on October 7th because of all the carnage that they have seen. So Israel is going backwards in terms of creating a possibility of peace for its people by this indiscriminate killing of people in pursuit of Hamas. But I'll tell you one other thing, even tactically speaking, there's almost no way that Israel can accomplish its goals of destroying Hamas and killing everybody, because how do they even know who Hamas is? I mean, unless you have a roster, they don't wear uniforms. And how do you distinguish a Hamas terrorist from just an angry Palestinian man who's upset that his family got killed or something? And you see that you're just going to create more and more. I've seen it with my own eyes in combat. And if they don't change something, they're not going to attain their political outcome, and they're going to create more strife for the future.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
The United States is urging Israel to move towards surgical operations against Hamas as opposed to its current broad ground campaign. The shift in the strategy, it was suggested by White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in his talks with Israel. Here's a report detailing the latest developments.
As Israel pounded the Gaza Strip on Thursday, Washington's envoy was in Tel Aviv to discuss how its ally could better protect Palestinian civilians in its war on Hamas militants. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and spoke with other officials, including the country's defense minister, about possibly transitioning to what the White House called lower-intensity military operations in Gaza. Here's White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby.
One of the things that Jake did talk to him about was progress in the war and where the Israelis think it's going to go. He did talk about possible transitioning from what we would call high-intensity operations, which is what we're seeing them do now, to lower-intensity operations sometime, in the near future. But I don't want to put a timestamp on it. I think you can understand that the last thing we'd want to do is telegraph to Hamas what they're likely to face in coming weeks and months.
At an event in Bethesda, Maryland, Reuters asked U.S. President Joe Biden if he wanted Israel to scale back its assault on Gaza by the end of the year.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
Meanwhile, in the Rafah area of southern Gaza, dozens of wounded people were taken to the hospital on Thursday after an Israeli airstrike targeted a house. Paramedics said 6 were killed in the airstrike and dozens were injured, including women and children. Israel launched its campaign in retaliation for a rampage by Hamas, whose fighters killed 1,200 Israelis and seized 240 hostages in a cross-border raid on October 7th. Since then, Israeli forces have bombarded the coastal strip and laid much of it to waste, with nearly 19,000 people confirmed dead according to Palestinian health officials, and thousands more feared buried under the rubble.
המלחמה הזאת הולכת להיות קשה, אבל אני מזהה, ודאי אתם רואים את זה גם בחומר, תחילה של שבירה.
Now, the American President Joe Biden is facing intense criticism for his support for Israel's response to what happened on the 7th of October and also for the aftermath of a relentless campaign of air bombing of the people in the Gaza Strip. Now, according to the health ministry in Gaza, an estimated 18,787 Palestinians, predominantly women and children, have been killed. And at least about 50,000 Palestinians have been seriously wounded or maimed in this campaign of relentless bombardment by the Israelis. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has vowed to press ahead with the Israeli offensive until what he describes is the end, and is rejecting all international pressure for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Now, Israel has vowed that it will continue till Hamas is eliminated, while much of the Gaza Strip has been reduced to nothing more than rubble. The Hamas fighters continue to maintain a pretty firm foothold in the besieged Gaza Strip, and the big question, of course, is, has Israel managed to weaken Hamas, and how far has it succeeded in rooting out Hamas? We're not talking militarily, but also in its standing amongst the Palestinian people. A wartime opinion poll amongst the Palestinian people shows a sharp rise in support for the resistance that Hamas fighters have been putting up, which appears to have ticked up even in the devastated Gaza Strip. The opinion poll also shows an overwhelming rejection of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, with nearly 90% of the Palestinian people saying that he must actually resign forthwith. The West Bank-based Palestinian Authority governed Gaza until a takeover by Hamas in 2007. Washington has called for the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority, currently led by Abbas, to eventually assume control of Gaza and to run both territories as a precursor to statehood. But Hamas has warned that any plans for Gaza that do not involve the group are an illusion and a mirage.
Any better arrangements in Gaza or in the Palestinian cause in general without Hamas and the resistance factions is an illusion and a mirage.
I think it's very important that we should all realize that Hamas is an integral part of the Palestinian political mosaic. And therefore, for Israel to claim that they are going to eliminate Hamas, I think this is something that is totally, it's first of all, is not going to happen and totally is not acceptable to us.
Now remember, Israel has drawn widespread international condemnation and also rare criticism from its staunchest ally, the United States, over the killings of tens of thousands of Palestinians in a span of just 2 months. The American President Joe Biden has said that Israel is actually losing support with its campaign of indiscriminate bombing of the Gaza Strip, and that Benjamin Netanyahu should actually change his tactics, exposing a clear rift in the relations between Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister.
We have every expectation that that Israel will do exactly what they say they're doing, which is to continue to go after the terrorist leaders and to do so in a way that minimizes civilian harm, as I said in my opening statement, as the President has said. That's their intent, and it's important that the results match that intent.
But also, Biden told a predominantly Jewish audience in the White House that Israel is in a pretty tight spot and that he has made his differences with Netanyahu pretty clear.
Assistance to innocent Palestinian civilians, to emphasize to our friends, to our Israeli friends, we need to protect civilian life.
But there's also a word of advice from the retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, citing experience of American troops fighting with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The former director of the CIA has cautioned that the very idea of Hamas must in fact also be combated. And this can only be done by making the life of the Palestinian people better than it was under Hamas's rule. The Biden administration is reportedly delaying the sale of more than 20,000 American-made assault rifles to Israel, over concerns that these assault rifles could actually end up in the hands of these illegal Israeli settlers who have resorted to a lot of violence and killings of the Palestinians in the West Bank. The Biden administration is apparently worried that a lot of these weapons could, of course, end up stoking more violence in the West Bank, a place where Hamas does not even exist. The administration last week began imposing visa bans on these illegal, violent Israeli settlers who've been involved in violent activities in the West Bank. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening in this war, we're being joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is a military expert and also the host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. He's joining us live from Sterling in Virginia. Now, Colonel Davis, these are some pretty strong words that we've heard from the American president. The differences between the American leadership, that is Joe Biden, and Netanyahu appear to be pretty clear. And also Jake Sullivan is, of course, traveling to Israel. What message do you think the Americans are giving to the Israelis in the aftermath of the horrific death toll of the Palestinians that we witnessed?
Well, I think that poll numbers that you cited just a moment ago is pretty sobering information and really confirms what many people here in the United States and apparently in the administration has been saying. You can't kill your way to peace in this situation. You can't just say we're going to kill all the Hamas fighters and then we're going to have peace, because you see there's been such a massive destruction of the ability of the Palestinians to even live after this is over, on top of the scores of thousands that have been killed and tens of thousands more that have been wounded. All that does is breed more contempt for Israel and more hatred. And when you see both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, actually a higher percentage of people in the West Bank in that same poll said that they believed that Hamas was right on October 7th because of all the carnage that they have seen. So Israel is going backwards in terms of creating a possibility of peace for its people by this indiscriminate killing of people in pursuit of Hamas. But I'll tell you one other thing, even tactically speaking, there's almost no way that Israel can accomplish its goals of destroying Hamas and killing everybody, because how do they even know who Hamas is? I mean, unless you have a roster, they don't wear uniforms. And how do you distinguish a Hamas terrorist from just an angry Palestinian man who's upset that his family got killed or something? And you see that you're just going to create more and more. I've seen it with my own eyes in combat. And if they don't change something, they're not going to attain their political outcome, and they're going to create more strife for the future.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because this is an interesting sentiment that was also echoed by General David Petraeus. He said that it is important to win the battle of hearts and minds, and if Israel is serious about actually rooting out Hamas, then Israel's job is to make the lives of the Palestinians better than what they had when Hamas was, of course, ruling them in the Gaza Strip. Do you think the Americans would be pushing the Israelis to, in fact, change their tactics? Because to root out Hamas, you need to convince the Palestinian people about it. And before this conflict began, before the 7th of October, Hamas's popularity within the Gazan people, the Palestinians in Gaza, was said to be very low. But since this conflict has gone up, the popularity of Hamas has shot up dramatically. What do you make of these tactics?
Yeah, the whole issue of winning hearts and minds, you might have had a shot at that before October 7th. There is no chance for that now. That's not even on the table. What you have to now do is just even create the possibility of a future and a hope for the Palestinian people. You're not going to win any hearts and minds now, not for the foreseeable future, because of the extraordinary level of anger that has been created by this, massive loss of life and physical destruction. So that's actually off the table. But if Israel doesn't even provide a possibility for future, then the anger is going to even escalate above what is happening because of all the loss of life. So whether Sullivan or President Biden or some of these other officials are telling Israel this behind the scenes, I don't know. I certainly hope so, because we're not doing them any favors by just saying you should be more careful and then not doing anything when they're not. Because Netanyahu has been abundantly clear. He doesn't care what they're saying. He doesn't care what Sullivan says. He is, in fact, he said just, I think yesterday, or maybe it was earlier today, he is going to continue to press forward. He will not do a ceasefire. Basically, he's not going to do anything that the U.S. is asking. And at some point, we're going to come to a point to where we have to say, you're on your own, or we're just going to say, we're going to continue to let you do whatever you want. And then we're not going to have any difference in the public opinion in the world that we're basically behind them. And that's the stark truth, no matter what anyone wants to say.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Davis, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Thank you.
The war between Israel and Hamas just continues to intensify. Now, Israel is pressing on with its offensive in the north and also in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And according to reports that have come in, an estimated 18,700 Palestinians have so far been killed in this campaign of relentless bombing of the Gaza Strip by the Israelis. And an estimated 50,000 Palestinians have been grievously wounded or have been maimed in this conflict so far. Now, Israel, remember, has approved some temporary aid into the Gaza Strip via its Kerem Shalom border. And here's a sum up of all that is happening. The Friday marks day 2 of the U.S. National Security Advisor's visit to Israel. Jake Sullivan met with Netanyahu and also with Yoav Gallant, echoing the United States' concern about the future of Gaza. Now, Jake Sullivan has said that it is pretty inappropriate for Israel to occupy Gaza in the long term. This after Israel reaffirmed on Thursday that Gaza war could, of course, drag on for several months to come. Now, remember, the violence is not confined just to the Gaza Strip. Even in the West Bank, part of the Palestinian-occupied territories, there have been repeated Israeli incursions deep into the Palestinian territories. And what has happened in the last 24 hours is that at least about 11 Palestinians have been killed, including a 13-year-old boy who reportedly died in the aftermath of this raid. The Israeli forces began their raid in Jenin early on Tuesday. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has held talks with the top U.S. officials in West Bank headquarters, emphasizing that Gaza is an integral part of the Palestinian state. He has also added that it is crucial to spare the civilians from the Israeli war machine. Now, Israel continues to pound Gaza with artillery and airstrikes, and smoke could be seen bellowing over the skyline in Gaza as Israeli helicopters and troops continued with their ground assault. The offensive is currently encircling Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. On Friday afternoon, a rare air raid warning went off in Jerusalem, with the Iron Dome intercepting some crude missiles that reportedly were fired. Now, Hamas rarely managed to shoot their crude missiles as far as Jerusalem, with most of the missiles targeting towns in southern Israel. And these images were reportedly released by Islamic Jihad in what it claims are Palestinian fighters firing mortar shells towards Israel. Now, Islamic Jihad is the second largest militant group in the Gaza Strip. The situation remains tense in Israel's northern border as well. For the first time since the war began, the Israeli army has dropped leaflets in southern Lebanon. The leaflets carried a warning for the residents to not help Hezbollah. Now, remember, the Hezbollah and Israeli army have been engaged in some skirmishes ever since this conflict began on the 7th of October. And Israel has also dropped similar leaflets during the 2006 war that it fought in Lebanon for a period of 34 days. Now, the Western nations and the European Union released a joint statement on Friday urging Israel to take to stop the unprecedented violence by the Israeli illegal settlers in the West Bank. The signatories included the likes of Australia, Britain, Canada, France, the European Union, along with several other European nations. The statement read that Israel must protect Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. Now, remember, over 280 Palestinian innocent civilians have been killed ever since this bout of violence began on the 7th of October. Moreover, the United Nations has warned that Gaza is teetering on the edge of a possible implosion. Over 1.8 million people have been displaced out of a population of 2.3 million. Hospitals in north have largely stopped functioning altogether, while in the south, they are overwhelmed with patients. And Israel says that it has been encouraging aid into the Gaza Strip, but the United Nations says that aid delivery has been hampered due to continuous air bombings by Israel. And whatever aid is being sent till the Rafah border crossing is not being allowed to enter because of this campaign of bombings even at the Rafah region. And I earlier spoke with Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College at Dublin. And this is what he had to say in terms of what is unfolding in the Gaza Strip at this moment.
You summarized it in that while the Americans have changed their rhetoric, talk is cheap in the context of actions. Actions which, after Hamas's killing of more than 1,200 people, most of them Israeli civilians and foreign nationals, has wound up killing now almost 19,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, the large majority of them civilians. If the United States was serious about curbing the Israeli air and ground attacks, they could have done one of two things, which you mentioned. They could have, earlier this week, cast their veto in the UN Security Council, they could have refrained from casting their veto in the UN Security Council earlier this week on a resolution calling for a ceasefire, therefore giving the diplomatic signal that this offensive should be halted. Or secondly, they could cut or restrict their military assistance to Israel.
First up on the show, well, has the Biden administration had a serious rethink over its support for Israel? If the latest comments are anything to go by, America wants the war to wrap up soon. It wants high-intensity fighting to end for more precision-targeted warfare, and it's asking for civilian casualties to go down. America's national security advisor is in Israel to exert pressure. Now, is the Biden administration clamping under domestic compulsions? In meetings with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of Israel's war cabinet, Jake Sullivan has urged Tel Aviv to shift military operations to more targeted actions. Sullivan, in fact, spoke to Israeli leaders about a timetable for winding down the intense combat phase of the war. American officials say they are not making judgments about whether Israel is abiding by the laws of war, but evidently the U.S. has gathered intelligence that might allow it to make such assessments. In fact, a new U.S. intelligence assessment has revealed that nearly half of the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza have been imprecise. They have been called dumb bombs that can pose a greater threat to civilians. In a first, Biden has also criticized Israel for its indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. He even declared that Netanyahu has to change, something he tried to walk back from the next day.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
This, as mixed signals have continued from America. Just on Tuesday, the White House spokesperson said that Israel had done a lot more to protect civilians than even America could. Now America is pushing its top advisor Sullivan to discuss a two-state solution with Israel that involves the Palestinian Authority as well.
I have and will continue to state President Biden and the United States' commitment to preserving space for peace, for a two-state solution where Israel's security is guaranteed.
Sullivan is also set to meet the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to discuss post-war arrangements for Gaza, and according to a senior U.S. official, this could include reactivating Palestinian security forces. Driven out by Hamas in its 2007 takeover of the territory, the proposal is the first specific indicator of Washington's vision for security arrangements in Gaza. If Israel achieves its U.S.-backed objective to end Hamas control, any role for Palestinian security forces in Gaza is bound to elicit strong opposition from Israel, which seeks to maintain an open-ended security presence there. Israel says it won't allow a post-war foothold for the Palestinian Authority. And with Netanyahu saying he's more determined than ever to continue the war, the Biden administration finds itself between a rock and a hard place, especially in view of opposing voices like the Vice President Kamala Harris urging him to show more sensitivity to the plight of Palestinian civilians.
So this, of course, is the big story of the moment, concern over the mounting casualties in the Israel-Hamas war. The American administration, which has a lot of leverage on Tel Aviv, is now trying to persuade Israel to try and change the strategy that Israel has deployed. Washington has sent its White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to Israel. Sullivan has met with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in Tel Aviv in an attempt to try and convince the Israelis the importance of protecting civilian lives. Now, according to a White House statement, Jake Sullivan and Netanyahu discussed the possibility of shifting from high-intensity clearing operations to undertaking some low-intensity surgical operations.
He did talk about possible transitioning from what we would call high-intensity operations, which is what we're seeing them do now, to lower-intensity operations sometime, in the near future. But I don't want to put a timestamp.
And also John Kirby said that Washington wants to see the war end as soon as possible. But the American spokesperson again added a bit of a rider, saying that it is Hamas that has the ultimate responsibility for ending this conflict.
If Hamas would release all the hostages, lay down their arms, and surrender up those responsible for the October 7th attacks.
Now, Israel, remember, has vowed to keep fighting. It has imposed a complete siege of the Gaza Strip and has continued with its devastating campaign of air bombings and also its ground offensive. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister has claimed that even though there is a lot of pain and there is a lot of international pressure because of the mounting civilian casualties and the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, there is nothing that Netanyahu says that will now stop the Israeli forces under him.
I see there is the start of an understanding that we are determined to continue until the end and to destroy this entity.
Now, despite the repeated American expressions of concern, Israel has not shown any signs of heeding the United States' calls for showing and exercising a certain level of restraint to protect civilian lives. A new U.S. intelligence assessment has said that nearly about 40 to 45% of the 29,000 air-to-ground ammunitions that Israel used in bombing the Gaza Strip were all dumb bombs. That means that these bombs were fired randomly at unspecified targets. Now, these unguarded missiles are in fact taking a huge toll on civilian lives, especially in these very densely populated areas. And the rate at which Israel is using the dumb bombs, it's unlikely that it can stem the soaring civilian death toll. No wonder then that the United States President Joe Biden is also facing a lot of backlash at home for his unequivocal support to the Israeli war. But remember, bear in mind, the Americans are the ones who are also supplying the Israelis with a lot of these dumb bombs. In the beginning of this month, Vice President Kamala Harris had urged her colleagues at the White House to show more concern publicly for the humanitarian damage in the Gaza Strip.
As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating.
Now, the United States has provided billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition and bombs that Israel has been dropping on the Gaza Strip. Nearly about 15,000 bombs and some 57,000 artillery shells have in fact been sent by Washington to Tel Aviv. A lot of the weapons that were meant to go to Ukraine are also being redirected to the Israelis. The United States has also provided diplomatic cover in the face of overwhelming international condemnation for Israel's conduct in this war, notably by vetoing a United Nations Security Council resolution that would have demanded for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So far, Netanyahu has rejected the US plan and is now betting his political survival on opposing the authorities' role in post-war Gaza. But this is, of course, going to be pretty difficult for the United States, and it now remains to be seen as to how this will play out diplomatically. And also to give us more perspective on this, we're being joined by Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College Dublin. Is joining us live from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, let me in fact begin by asking you this. What we've witnessed over the course of the last few days is that the United States appears to have changed its stance to a certain extent in the way it has been backing Israel. It is urging Tel Aviv to exercise more restraint, to ensure that the civilian casualties that are being witnessed in the Gaza Strip are not as bad as what is being witnessed. Do you think the Americans can actually prevail over Tel Aviv?
I think you summarized it in that while the Americans have changed their rhetoric, talk is cheap in the context of actions. Actions which, after Hamas's killing of more than 1,200 people, most of them Israeli civilians and foreign nationals, has wound up killing now almost 19,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, the large majority of them civilians. If the United States was serious about curbing the Israeli air and ground attacks, they could have done one of two things, which you mentioned. They could have earlier this week cast their veto in the UN Security Council, they could have refrained from casting their veto in the UN Security Council earlier this week on a resolution calling for a ceasefire, therefore giving the diplomatic signal that this offensive should be halted. Or secondly, they could cut or restrict their military assistance to Israel. But far from doing that, American officials, I suspect American officials who are not happy with what is going on, leaked to the media last week that the United States since October the 7th has provided more than 15,000 bombs and more than 50,000 shells to Israel. More than 10,000 of those 15,000 bombs, as you mentioned, are unguided bombs. They're not precise. They don't target fighters. They kill civilians as well. Despite that coming out, Joe Biden last Friday, even as he said civilian casualties should be limited, asked Congress to authorize another 45,000 tank shells to Israel. Tank shells which would not be used to defend Israel, but in an offensive. So no, I'm sorry. Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Kamala Harris, you don't have leverage over Israel because you gave up your leverage over Israel. And no statements you make, no statements that Jake Sullivan matter publicly today if there is not a private challenge to the Israeli War Cabinet to stop this killing of civilians as well as of Hamas fighters. And if you don't stop this killing of civilians, we will call for a ceasefire and we will restrict the military shipments.
And also, Professor Lucas, how isolated do you think the United States has become on the international scene because of its backing of Israel? We've been witnessing as to how, this issue has been voted upon both in the UNSC and also in the UNGA, where unequivocally there are nations that have been demanding that there should be a humanitarian ceasefire, but the United States is the one that has used its veto at the UNSC to block a resolution demanding for the ceasefire.
Well, I think, again, clearly you summarized it, and that is there have been a number of countries who have not yet called for a ceasefire. Indeed, the European Union at its summit today in Brussels is unlikely to call for a ceasefire while they are moving towards calling for more humanitarian aid. But in that Security Council of 15 members earlier this week, 13 voted for a ceasefire, including France, including Asian members. The United Kingdom abstained on the resolution. Only the U.S. votes no.
Absolutely.
In the General Assembly, a couple of days later, when an overwhelming 153 of 193 nations call for a ceasefire, countries like France, Japan, Australia vote for the ceasefire. The U.S. again votes no. So no, there is no moral as well as political high ground that the U.S. can claim right now when it is seen as enabling, not just standing aside from, but enabling the ongoing killing in Gaza.
Absolutely indeed, Professor Lucas. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with that perspective there.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, a new U.S. intelligence assessment has found that almost half of the air-to-ground munitions Israel has used in Gaza since the war began have been unguided bombs. The revelation comes as the United States and Israeli officials engage in intensifying conversations about the sequencing of military operations in the conflict. Now, Gaza officials say Israel's military offensive has killed nearly 19,000 people, most of whom were women and children. Now, these unguided bombs are otherwise known as dumb bombs. The use of so many unguided bombs, first reported by CNN, is a concern among humanitarian groups and others. Washington has been calling for weeks for Israel to take more care to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, saying that too many Palestinians have been killed. Now, what exactly are these dumb or unguided bombs? They are conventional or nuclear aircraft-delivered bombs that do not contain a guidance system. Now, in the absence of a guidance system, such bombs simply follow a ballistic trajectory. Now, this makes them far harder to aim and therefore far more likely to strike unintended targets. Therefore, they put civilians at risk. Dumb bombs were used commonly during the Second World War, and they continued to make up the vast majority of aircraft-delivered bombs until the late 1980s. They have now largely been replaced by precision-guided munitions, which are guided towards a specific target. Dumb bombs are typically aerodynamic in shape, usually with tail fins, to reduce drag and increase stability after release. In order to detonate upon impact, they tend to use a contact fuse. An increasing number of voices in the United States, notably from the left wing of the Democratic Party, have called on Biden to take a firmer stand towards his Israeli ally and even to condition military aid. As for Politico, U.S. Vice President has been telling colleagues in the administration that she wants the White House to show more concern for the humanitarian damage in Gaza. In internal talks about the war in Gaza, Kamala Harris has argued that it is time to start making day-after plans for how to handle the wreckage of the war once the fighting ends. Harris's push to shape the White House message reflects the extent to which Democrats, even the top two officials in the nation, are struggling to walk a careful line. Infighting is spreading, slowly but meaningfully, at every layer of the Democratic Party over Biden's full-throated support of Israel. Pro-Palestinian Democrats are outraged at the rising death tolls in Gaza made possible by Biden's posture. Day after day, more House Democrats are criticizing Israel's expanding ground operations, raising concerns with Biden's policy and even calling for a ceasefire. Our top story at this hour, a new U.S. intelligence assessment has found that almost half of the air-to-ground munitions Israel has used in Gaza since the war began have been unguided bombs. Now, the revelation comes as the United States and Israeli officials engage in intensifying conversations about the sequencing of military operations in the conflict. Gaza officials say Israel's military offensive has killed nearly 19,000 people, most of whom were women and children. Now, these unguided bombs are otherwise known as dumb bombs. The use of so many unguided bombs, first reported by CNN, is a concern among humanitarian groups and others. Washington has been calling for weeks for Israel to take more care to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, saying that too many Palestinians have been killed. Now, what exactly are these dumb or unguided bombs? They are conventional or nuclear aircraft-delivered bombs that do not contain a guidance system. In the absence of a guidance system, such bombs simply follow a ballistic trajectory. This makes them far harder to aim and therefore far more likely to strike unintended targets, Therefore, they put civilians at risk. Dumb bombs were used commonly during the Second World War, and they continued to make up the vast majority of aircraft-delivered bombs until the late 1980s. They have now largely been replaced by precision-guided munitions, which are guided towards a specific target. Dumb bombs are typically aerodynamic in shape, usually with tail fins to reduce drag and increase stability after release. In order to detonate upon impact, they tend to use a contact fuse. An increasing number of voices in the United States, notably from the left wing of the Democratic Party, have called on Biden to take a firmer stand toward his Israeli ally and even to condition military aid. As for Politico, US Vice President has been telling colleagues in the administration that she wants White House to show more concern for the humanitarian damage in Gaza. The internal talks about the war in Gaza. Kamala Harris has argued that it is time to start making day-after plans to how to handle wreckage of the war once the fighting ends. Harris's push to shape the White House message reflects the extent to which Democrats, even the top two officials in the nations, are struggling to walk a careful line. Infighting is spreading, but slowly, but meaningfully at every layer of the Democratic Party over Biden's full-throated support of Israel. Pro-Palestinian Democrats are outraged at the rising death tolls in Gaza, made possible by Biden's posture. Day after day, more House Democrats are criticizing Israel's expanding ground operations, raising concern with Biden's policy and even calling for a ceasefire.
Hospital, refugee camp, school, there is nowhere safe in Gaza. The situation right now is dire. It is getting worse with every single day as this war stretches. There is no food, no clean water, no medicines. As per the UN, half the population in Gaza, which is around 1 million people, are at risk of starvation. Our next report explains.
Even in death, these Palestinians are not allowed to rest in peace. Israel's recent attacks on the Jabalia refugee camp have damaged the graves of hundreds of Gazans. What you see are marks reportedly left by IDF vehicles. It has been almost 70 days, and the war on Gaza knows no end. The death toll is near 19,000. Half a million people have been injured. Around 1.8 million, that is 80% of the Gaza population, is displaced.
The boy was born early in the war, a little over a month ago. My love, my love.
Infants, elderly, men and women, all are the casualties in this war. Israel is headstrong on its motive. They want to wipe out Hamas. But it's the civilians who are paying the price. Most of those killed in this Israeli operation are Gazan civilians. The concerns over the collective punishment keeps getting louder. For For those living in the besieged strip, the reality is no less than doomsday. People don't know if they will survive another day. And if they do, how will they keep themselves alive with no supplies, no clear water, no real roof on their head?
There is no food or drink. The house is destroyed. There is nothing. There is no money. Please stop the war in us. For God's sake. We are innocent people. We have nothing. We own nothing.
This week, a senior UN official raised alarm over the collapsing humanitarian situation in Gaza.
About half of the population in Gaza are starving, and the needs that we are meeting is really nothing. The humanitarian operation is collapsing. With the chaos, with this active fighting, it's not possible to do the work that is needed to meet these massive needs. And so we need supplies at a completely different scale.
Israel is attacking Gaza in the north, south, and center. One such city is Rafah that was attacked this week. Many were killed. Dozens were dragged out of the rubble. As desperate Gazans cry, where is the safe zone?
Where is the safe zone? The border to Egypt is only 300 meters away. They told us to come from the north to the south, and here we are at the extreme south. Where is the safe zone?
Along with millions of Gazans, near 137 hostages remain in the strip. This week, Israel reportedly kickstarted its plan to flood all the Gazan tunnels with seawater. They plan to drive out Hamas from the vast underground network, to render its ammunition and supply useless, to drown Hamas militants to death. But what Israel is also afraid of is that in doing so, it will be endangering the lives of hostages who are likely held in the same tunnels. You don't have to search for tragedy in Gaza. It finds you on every street, strewn with trash and stagnant water, desolate and foreboding. It is a dystopian reality that even the best fiction writers cannot imagine.
We begin with our top focus right now. Saudi Foreign Minister has said that he's concerned about the potential for escalation in the Red Sea region. And the statement came on Friday as attacks from the Houthi-controlled Yemen struck two flagged ships, which were Liberian and in the Bab al-Mandab Strait. And this is as per the U.S. military.
Of course, we are concerned about the potential for escalation. Our region is very complex, and we do not need any other conflicts to erupt, and therefore we hope that we will be able to avoid any further escalations in our region.
Earlier, shipping giant Maersk had announced their decision to suspend all container shipments through the Red Sea, and the German transport company Hapag-Lloyd has also suspended its Red Sea container ship traffic. Now, Maersk, which is one of the world's largest shipping companies, also decided to send the vessels on a detour around Africa, and this was confirmed by a spokesperson for the company. The Danish firm's vessel, which was traveling from Salalah in Oman to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, was targeted by the missile near the Bab el-Mandab Strait and linking the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Now, the company said that it was making the move after a near miss involving its Maersk ship. Now, the company confirmed that the crew and the vessel were safe. The recent series of attacks come after Yemen's Houthi rebels vowed to target vessels in the Red Sea and in an attempt to put pressure on Israel to stop bombing the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, German transport company Hapag-Lloyd has said that it was halting Red Sea container ship traffic until December 18th and after the Houthis attacked one of its vessels. It was en route from the Greek port to Singapore and there was no casualty, and the ship is now traveling on towards its destination. These incidents have raised fears in the global supply chains, which could be severely disrupted. And if the attacks continue in the narrow, busy waterway, at least 3 container ships have been attacked or disrupted near Yemen in the past day or before. Maersk Houthis militants said that they attacked the MSC Alanya and MSC Palatium 3 cargo container ships with naval missiles. And Houthi spokesperson also said that the ships were targeted after they refused to respond to warnings from Yemeni naval forces. Now, further, apart from discussing the idea of a naval coalition with allies, the U.S. is also focusing on reducing Houthis' threat in the Red Sea. And the U.S. envoy for Yemen said that Washington wants to form the broadest possible maritime coalition to protect ships in the Red Sea and send an important signal to the Houthis that further attacks will not be tolerated. Now, even though the United States believes that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is helping to plan and carry out the Houthi missile and drone attacks, Iran has denied any involvement.
گروه‌های مقاومت در منطقه نمایندگان کشورها و ملت‌های خود هستند. بر اساس منافع خود و کشورها و ملت‌های خودشون تصمیم میگیرند، بررسی میکنند، به صورت خودجوش و اقدام میکنند. بنابراین این گونه اظهارات در چارچوب فرافکنی است و برای فرار از شرایط بغرنجی است که رژیم صهیونیستی با اون مواجه است.
The Houthis are involved in the Israel-Hamas conflict and now they have further expanded their actions. They have been attacking vessels in vital shipping lanes and launching drones and missiles at Israel from over 1,000 miles away in Yemen's capital. Now, earlier they had even cleared their intentions to target all the ships heading to Israel, regardless of their nationalities.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he is more determined than ever to continue the war with Hamas. And this even as White House top advisor Jake Sullivan, who is in Israel to negotiate, told him to scale down the Gaza offensive. Sullivan met Netanyahu and the rest of Israel's war cabinet on Thursday. The White House says he urged Israel to shift from high-intensity military operations to a more targeted phase. Speaking to the media, he said that governance of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip needs to be connected under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Earlier, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said it will take more than several months to destroy Hamas. Israel faces mounting international pressure and isolation amid its onslaught that has killed thousands so far. Even its strongest ally, the United States, wants Israel to be careful.
I want them to be focused on how to save civilian lives, not stop going after Hamas, but be more careful.
Jake Sullivan will also meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah on Friday. Ahead of this meet, the Palestinian Prime Minister has expressed disappointment with the United States' veto to UN resolutions calling for ceasefire in Gaza and has urged the United States to act on implementing a two-state solution.
Every American official who arrives here to meet with us, they again repeat the same thing, that United States is for two states. Now that United States has talked the talk, we want Washington to walk the walk, meaning that we need specific measures to implement the two-state solution, not only believe in two states.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog, meanwhile, has joined other Israeli officials against a possible two-state solution for long-lasting peace in the region.
In order to get back to the idea of dividing the land or negotiating peace or talking to the Palestinians, etc., one has to deal first and foremost with the emotional trauma that we're going through and the need and demand for full sense of security for our people.
Now, amid the negotiation efforts, Israel continues with its offensive in Gaza. The Israeli military says dozens of Hamas fighters surrendered in the last 24 hours, while the internet and telephone services providers in Gaza said communications were cut across the war-torn area on Thursday. On the other hand, Hamas has played down Israel's attempts to flood the group's tunnels in Gaza. It says when militants built them, they took all considerations of what could happen.
Those tunnels were built by well-trained and educated engineers, and they have considered any kind of attacks may happen by the Israelis, including bombing water.
Violence also rages on in the West Bank. Israeli troops kill 12 Palestinians in raids on Thursday inside the city of Jenin. Palestinian authorities accused desecration of a mosque by some Israeli soldiers as it condemned the operation as a dangerous escalation. Israel's army said it would discipline the soldiers on the reports of desecration.
Well, Israeli leaders are reiterating that war in Gaza will continue until Hamas is defeated. Israel's foreign minister has stressed that the offensive will go on with or without international support. However, the Hamas's chief, Ismail Haniyeh, has now said the group is ready to discuss with Israel any arrangement or initiative that could lead to a ceasefire in Gaza. Although he also said that any plan for post-war Gaza that does not involve Hamas is a delusion. In the latest, Israel's ambassador to the UK has also declared that her country will absolutely reject any possibility of a two-state solution after the war in Gaza ends. When asked about how peace will be achieved to establish a Palestinian state, she responded, and I quote, "Israel knows today and the world should know now that the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel." Israel's strongest ally, the United States, has expressed concern over civilian casualties in Gaza. As per reports, it has delayed the sale of 20,000 assault rifles to Israel over settler violence in West Bank. The U.S. National Security Advisor is going to visit Israel for a two-day trip starting Thursday. He is also likely to make other stops in the West Asian region. Talks on hostages and humanitarian aid will be the focus of his visit. Meanwhile, Israel has announced that it has suffered its worst combat losses so far in the war. It reported 10 of its soldiers killed in the past 24 hours. This includes a colonel commanding a forward base and a lieutenant colonel commanding a regiment.
86 חללים, 86 קברים חדשים נוספו בהר הרצל בלבד מאז מתקפת הרצח של ה-7 באוקטובר. מחיר כבד, כבד מאוד. אבל המטרה שלשמה נפלו היא מטרה ראויה. אין ראויה ממנה ואין צודקת ממנה.
The Israeli army released footage showing troops fighting in the southern Gaza. Israel has intensified its attacks in the region after the fighting renewed following a brief pause. Hamas has also released a video showing its operations in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. Now, these
انظروا بتوكل على الله.
تفجير عبود تلفزيونية، قوات خاصة وعبود.
And well, these are the scenes in Rafah in the south of Gaza. In the aftermath of the Israeli strikes, people can be seen being rushed to hospitals in ambulances. Remember, Rafah is the region that is the border crossing to leave the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, violence is also raging in the West Bank. As per the Palestinian Health Ministry, an Israeli raid in the area entered its second day on Wednesday, as it left at least 7 Palestinians dead. The Israeli military said the forces confiscated approximately 30 weapons, ammunition, military equipment and weapon parts. The military did not comment on those killed, however. And for the very latest on the situation, Jody Cohen, our correspondent, sent us this report from Israel.
So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is in Israel for meetings on Thursday with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Herzog and the War Cabinet. As far as I can see, they're going to be discussing 3 key issues. Number 1 is the timetable of this war. We know the US wants the main operation to be over by January. Israel has said that they expect the operation in Khan Yunis to be over by then, but that the war must end when Hamas is no longer a threat and the 135 hostages have been returned. The second issue will be the Israeli hostages and Palestinian civilians as well. Now, White House spokesperson John Kirby said that Israel's done possibly more than the US would have done to protect civilian lives in this war. For example, he said, by giving warning to Palestinian civilians and therefore to the enemy of targets in advance. They're going to be talking about aid. State Department spokesperson Miller has reported good progress, saying that more safe routes have been opened for civilians and aid to move around. But the US wants Israel to open its crossing between Gaza and Israel. Israel has said in the past that that's hard to do while under attack, and that Hamas has fired approximately 120 rockets from the humanitarian safe zones, which are supposed to be without any fighting, and that 1/3 of these fell short within Gaza. So it remains to be seen what happens on that front. And the third issue is the post-war Gaza. The US agrees that Hamas has to go. In the short term, there's talk of a security role for Israel, in an interim role for Arab or international forces, and a long-term role. The US wants to see a revitalized Palestinian Authority governing Gaza. Now, according to a Palestinian Research Center poll that's just been published, 82% of Palestinians